Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Ask the Author. My name is Lauren Chester, and I work in the communications team at the International Transport Forum. I'm joined by Parnika Ray, the lead author of the report Youth on the Move, Young People and Transport in the 21st Century. This report came out a few weeks ago and investigates how young people use transport and why this is important for society. Young people have different mobility needs, and their choices depend on a range of socioeconomic factors. What is important is that young people's travel behaviour and aspiration could influence how sustainable transport will become in the future. However, young people's views are rarely taken into account when making decisions about transport policy and planning. A reminder that if this is your first Ask the Author, this is a 30-minute session where our experts give a brief presentation on the main findings of their research. Then it will be over to you to ask questions. So please use the Q&A function, not the chat, to send in your questions, which you can start doing now. And Parnika will try and answer as many of these as she can. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Parnika.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. Without further ado, I will go straight into the findings of this report. So as Lauren already mentioned, youth are a significant segment of society. However, their needs are not always considered in traditional transport planning, which often prioritizes predictable daily commutes. The daily mobility of young people may differ from other transport users, as they may travel outside of peak hours, depending on their educational and employment situation. The destinations that they go to may not be well served by existing transport options. How young people use transport matters for society from a sustainability, economic development, livability, and well-being perspective. Youth are 16% of the world's population, and in some regions like sub-Saharan Africa, they're up to 20% of the world's total population. It is also important to remember that young people are not homogeneous. Geography, age, and gender characterize a part of the diversity of youth. Other groups, such as youth with disabilities or vulnerable youth, also face challenges specific to their situation. Now, the term youth varies from country to country. Youth is a social construct that depends on cultural, economic, institutional, and other factors. In this publication, we have focused on the population between the age group of 15 to 29 when we refer to youth or young people. The report draws on two distinct approaches to defining young adults, the transitional and the generational approach. The transitional approach investigates the relationship between mobility patterns and the transition of young people through different life stages. This includes changes in mobility preferences and constraints as young people attain the traditional markers of adulthood. Researchers have also seen that since the early 2000s, young people are taking longer to attain these markers, such as living independently, having stable employment, getting married, and so on. And this in turn influences their transport choices. On the other hand, the generational approach identifies distinct cohorts based on the year of birth. The approach focuses on shared experiences, including mobility patterns of a cohorts like millennials or Gen Z, rather than the transitions that they undergo as they move through different life stages. Now, young people's mobility choices are not just individual preferences, but they are driven by socioeconomic factors and limited resources. They typically have less disposable income than older people. Young people travel mainly for education, for training, for first jobs, or to meet friends. Youth are pragmatic when it comes to mobility. They are more multimodal than other age groups and are early adopters of innovations in the transport sector. Moreover, young people are more likely to use public transport, and car ownership is lower among them than older people. So next, the main factors that influence their transport choices are cost, reliability, safety of transport services. Enhanced digital connectivity also impacts their mobility behavior. Further, where young people live, that is urban, suburban, or rural, and their living arrangement, that is if they live alone, with parents, with a partner, or so on, their employment situation and their overall financial condition plays a role in their travel choices, especially with respect to car ownership and usage. All these factors act in conjunction and not in isolation to shape youth travel behavior. We know that the lack of transport availability can negatively impact education and employment choices for the youth and impact long-term outcomes in terms of skills development, future income, and even health. Now, the report is is divided into sort of insights from the global north and global south, because we've analyzed data accordingly. So first, I will present some insights from the global north. In high-income countries, we find that young people mostly still rely on cars for their daily activities, although they drive less than previous generations. Up to 45% of the trips are made by car, as shown in this example from the EU, as a driver or passenger. Car usage, ownership, and level of driving licensing is lower among young people than older people, and it's continuing to decline. The main reason behind this is financial constraints. Other reasons include delays in starting a family, increased motoring costs, late entry into a job market, or living in an urban area where there are alternatives. Car dependency, of course, varies between urban, suburban, and rural areas. Next, walking is the most popular way to get around after cars, followed by cycling and public transport. We also see that the trends from the last decade indicate that the overall trip making among the entire population is declining, but there are larger declines for younger people. Research indicates that increased online activity may have replaced some physical trips. If the reduction in the number of trips is because of enhanced digital accessibility and therefore a need for less travel, then it is not a cause for worry. However, policymakers must be aware if young people wish to make trips, but they cannot due to financial constraints or because of lack of transport options. While it is difficult to show a causal link between making trips and access to opportunities, we do have some evidence that such a link exists. Next, we also see that the trend to drive less is not always accompanied with a significant increase in the overall in the use of other modes of travel, like walking, cycling, or use of public transport. Instead, overall reduction in trip making is observed among young people. Another insight is that even though young adults are more likely to use public transport where available compared to older adults, these preferences are often a result of lifestyle factors, such as having a student status, not having children, or having lower income. Demographic factors, perhaps racial or ethnic minority, locational factors, where they live, if it's a transit-rich neighborhood or not, these are the factors that affect the preferences. However, when youth transition to a different life phase or they change their location to another area, these choices can adjust. We also see that we have to talk about micromobility, of course, when it comes to youth mobility. There is an uptake of shared micromobility options by young people. Data in this graph includes all user age groups. However, there are studies that show that the younger cohorts of the population are at the forefront of using these services, especially with e-scooters. Now, the fact that ridership and trips per day of shared micromobility services are increasing despite the removal or reduction of some of these vehicles in cities by local authorities. We recommend that the uptake and regulation of these alternative modes of transport must be greatly encouraged because these modes support the car-free lifestyles of young people. From here, we will go into the insights from the Global South. So here in the Global South countries that we analyzed, we found that data is typically lacking in terms of both aggregate and disaggregate. There are not that many national travel surveys readily available. And it is unclear if youth in low and middle income countries are making fewer or more trips than previous generations, if the trips are increasing, commute times are increasing or decreasing, or if the number of vehicles on the roads, they have increased, but we don't know how much of these are used by the youth compared to walking, cycling, or public transport. So one of the recommendations of this report is that policymakers must prioritize data collection. And nevertheless, based on the data and the studies that we have, we found that walking, cycling, and the use of formal and informal transportation services are the main mobility modes for young people. In this context, it is important to acknowledge the role of informal transport systems. They serve areas where public transport may not exist and also where first and last mile connectivity is missing. While some of the challenges faced by young people in the Global South are similar to that of the Global North, stark differences do exist. Limited access to affordable public transport, the lack of road safety regulations and enforcement, poor pedestrian infrastructure, all affect youth mobility. For this reason, research shows that young people in this context overwhelmingly aspire to own private vehicles. Well, the bottom line is that in the Global South, young people are predominantly already using sustainable modes of transport. Policymakers must encourage and reward this behavior rather than allowing bad experiences to shape unsustainable future choices. The fact that young people walk, cycle, or use public transport is because of financial constraints here, and due to the lack of alternatives, and not because it is a preference. So what can policymakers really do to shape travel behavior? We know that young people must be included in transport planning and decision making. They should be actively involved in these issues. Youth advisory committees can be created to ensure that their voices are heard from the national to the local level. There are barriers to participation, but the participation will align solutions with the challenges. We know that car dependency is reducing and young people are multimodal. So policymakers must seize this opportunity to shape long-term sustainable transit behavior by investing in public transport, a dense network of shared mobility options, and walking and cycling infrastructure. Along with the investments in hard infrastructure and also incentives such as giving tax credits or subsidies, soft measures can complement these measures to shape youth travel behavior. So policymakers can really shape youth mobility from an early age through educational awareness and promotional campaigns that position sustainable transport as healthy, enjoyable, and trendy. Lastly, as I've already mentioned, data is very important for evidence-based policy making. We need both qualitative and quantitative data to calibrate transport policies. National travel surveys must collect data that is disaggregated by age, gender, income, and other demographic factors. Such surveys are missing in many contexts. While one-off surveys do provide some insights, we do need more consistent data collection to analyze trends over time. Lastly, youth, we know, are pragmatic. They're multimodal. They do not reject any means of transport, and they're early adopters of innovation. Policymakers must act on this and give youth a voice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Parnika, for that presentation. Just a few things. You'll notice I popped the link to the report to download the report in the chat if you haven't already done so. Please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function to send in your questions. We're still waiting, so I'm going to take this as an opportunity to ask my own. So Parnika, I know an important aspect of this topic is environmental concerns. As young people are seen to be at the forefront of the climate change debate, do environmental attitudes impact the transport choices of young people?
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, there is no doubt that young people are worried about climate change and they are at the forefront of this global conversation. However, we did not find the academic evidence or data to conclusively say that young people are basing their transport decisions on environmental attitudes only. There are studies that examine this relationship. However, only a small proportion of those studies focus on youth. There are also a lot of media articles which recently have attributed the decline in car driving by saying that this is because of youth environmental attitudes, that they are concerned about the environment. There may be some truth to this, but our research primarily indicates that it is financial constraints and some other factors that I listed during the presentation, like where young people live, their household composition, if they have a family or not. These are the factors that are really impacting their, the choice to own a car or not, especially in car-centric places like the US. And we do see that, pro-environmental attitudes, especially with relationship to transport, is pronounced among financially secure youth, who have more realistic prospects of attaining those traditional markers of adulthood. This is not to say that millennials or Gen Z don't regard the environment in their choices, but vehicle ownership is not a voluntary choice, and they may prioritize other more important factors like getting a good job or getting a good education over certain concerns when it comes. I mean, reliable transport is key to that.
Yeah, so essentially what you're saying is that it's really dependent on the experiences or the childhood experiences as to how they use transport in the future. So that plays quite a big role, does it?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's only childhood, the influence of childhood, exposure to certain things. Yes, it does matter. I mean, we do know from the research that if that the propensity to cycle more happens if young people know how to cycle when they were children. So knowing to cycle at a young age allows them it's easier for them to cycle later in life. The same goes for public transport. It removes certain psychological barriers if they've used it since they were young, just from a practical point of view, from ticketing to wayfinding and all of that. So we do know that there are certain aspects that influence childhood. What they've learned as children may continue, but it's more about the external circumstances and certain also personal circumstances that influence long-term travel behavior. Policymakers can, influence choices by providing alternatives. The point here is not that to incentivize the use of cars, it's rather to incentivize, the use of public transport, active mobility, by providing those affordable options and making those available. Also, promoting the awareness and the education around that. So children can be taught to cycle at a young age. They should then have that option later on in life. We also know that young people who acquire a driving license later in life, so for example, in their 40s rather than in their 20s, they do tend to drive less in the long term. So that evidence is also there. So, I would say it's a combination of many different factors and not just the childhood influence.
Mm. Yeah, I can see why, therefore, a more holistic approach would be needed. We have some questions coming in, and it's great because this was also one of my questions, because here at the ITF, we like to apply a gender lens to all of our research. So Gina Porter is asking, could you say a little bit about the gender differences in youth mobility?
Yes, thank you for that great question, and thank you, Gina. She is one of the advisors on this project, so thank you for your support during this. Yes, indeed, youth mobility. We do look at all our projects at the ITF through the gender lens, and we have looked at youth mobility through this gender lens, and I will elaborate a little bit on that. But before I do elaborate, I want to say that there will always be context-specific differences that need to be analyzed at a granular level with more qualitative and quantitative data. But having said that, we looked at national level data where it's available in the form of national travel surveys to understand if there are any differences in terms of gender. So, for example, we looked at national travel surveys from the United States and England. And for this age bracket, the 15 to 29 that we were looking at, we actually found that there is not that much of a significant difference between the trip making of young men and young women. They approximately make the same number of trips. And in some cases, in fact, women are making slightly more trips than men. In England, for example, young women are they make slightly higher walking trips than men, but men cycle more. But this is bearing in mind that cycle trips are only 2% of all trips that are made by young people in general. So it's not a significant amount. So when I say that men are making more trips, it's still 2% of all their trips. So that's quite low. But yes, that difference exists. In terms of driving, we did not observe significant differences in terms of driving trips or driving licensing. But we do know that more young mothers are drivers compared to women without children, because that is one of the factors that there is a correlation with car ownership. And we also noticed that there is a gender bias when it comes to the study of rental e-scooters, for example, in one of the studies in the UK, where more young men are using rental e-scooters than young women. However, okay, this is from the global north, but we did look at the global south as well. And here the distinctions are more stark. There is a study from Dr. Porter, which looks at Ghana, Malawi, and South Africa. And there is certainly a gender aspect to cycling. We do see that young women or girls, they do not know how to cycle as much as boys. Almost the difference is like almost 50% more or less. Like 44% girls in Malawi know to cycle compared to 72% of boys, for example. So that is definitely a stark difference. And cycling, again, is low in these countries. In India, we found that women walk more than men, whereas men use more two-wheeler motorized transport, and they also cycle more than women. When it comes to safety and security, that's another aspect where gender plays a very big role. I mean, across the globe, we see that gender-based violence and harassment is influencing young women's engagement with transport. In London, there is a survey where more than half of the women said that they were exposed to harassment. In Sri Lanka, it was 90% of women who said they were exposed to harassment in public transport. And the fear is not limited only to women. Men also in these contexts report fear of theft, pickpocketing, or assaults. And but that said, it is an important factor, and we do see that there are trade-offs. So young women often choose lesser opportunities in terms of education or employment because they do not have the safe transport options available to them. And lastly, there's one figure that I would like to say when it comes to road traffic crashes globally, it is the leading cause of death for young people from age 5 to 29, but it is staggeringly high for young men under 25. It's about 73% of all traffic deaths. So these are broadly the differences we've seen. There's a lot more in the report, so I do encourage our who are here to please do read the report. Thanks.
Thanks, Parnika, for that comprehensive answer. I know I myself was quite shocked at that statistic that road crashes are the leading cause of death for young people. So I think that's something that needs to be taken quite seriously. We have the next question from Aditya Sharma, who actually helped write this report. Can advanced economies and international organizations help countries in the global south to better measure multimodality?
Yes. Thank you for the question, Aditya, and thanks for your support on the report. International organizations and was it international organizations and sorry if you could just repeat that, please.
Yep, sorry. International organizations and can advanced economies and international organizations?
Yes. So I would say, in fact, there are, already, like the ITF does its annual road safety report. There is the safe systems approach. There are several reports on that the ITF has published in the past that we do refer to in this publication. It is quite comprehensive. So the approaches are there. The global best standards practices are also mentioned. And in fact, I think it is the onus on policymakers from countries to take these standards and to apply them. And I think the ITF is quite vocal in this aspect. I think we do have our road safety program of work where we do a lot of work, and we do have partners across the globe that are participating in this. Indeed, the knowledge sharing has to happen, but in terms of standards, they do exist. Even from organizations like GDCI, which is the Global Designing Cities Initiative. They have their street design guidelines. They have street design guidelines for young people, which is very specifically about how do you make safe streets, safe road networks for the most young people in society and for the most vulnerable. So these guidelines are out there. I would say that a lot of work is being done, and the onus is really on different levels of government in countries, from national, regional to local, to take up these guidelines and to implement them.
Thanks. Our next question is from Kushi Jain. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. He wants to know how we can account for architectural reasons which promote or reduce the loss of public mobility. So some cities might be fundamentally more walkable than others. I guess this also touches on the differences between rural areas and cities, which I know can impact youth transport as well.
So if I may understand correctly, the question is, how does architecture or the urban design of cities impact mobility?
Yes, the loss of public mobility. So whether a city is walkable or not.
All right. Yeah. So I do not see the question. So this is why I'm depending a little bit on you, Lauren, to read the questions out to me. Thanks a lot for that question. Yes, there is a close link between the built environment and public space. Roads are the biggest public space that is available in cities. So that they are almost, in many cities, they take up to 40% of road space. Road space of a city's area is streets, and that is the greatest public space that cities have. And it is not only for fast-moving traffic, it is also for slow-moving traffic. It's for active mobility. It's for cycling and for all the different types of users that who are present in the city. So there is a link between urban design, how a street at the street level is designed, but there is also the urban planning aspect, which is slightly at a zoomed out level, which is land use and transport planning, which are also closely connected, which basically shape whether an urban environment is walkable or not. What are your land uses? If you have mixed use developments, cities are definitely more vibrant, they're more walkable. If you have a public realm that is well connected with open spaces, with parks, so there are many layers to this. I mean, I could go on forever about that, but yes, there is a key link between how we design our cities and how walkable or safe they are for all different kinds of users. There is a key connection between land use planning and transport. And there is also density. I think that's another important aspect. Low density rural areas, it is harder to have public transport there just because of the lack of density. But then there can be buses there. Policymakers can encourage the use of shared mobility in those situations, and also the uptake of micromobility services, cycling, active infrastructure, all of that. There is great work going on in this sector as well. And urban areas, we have the concept of the 15-minute city now, and that has really been around also for many years in different forms. A walkable city has been a concept for a long time now. I think it's just acting on those concepts, really.
Thanks, Parnika. Just before I go to my next question, which will probably be the last question, I'm just going to launch a quick poll, just 2 questions. It will help us improve these sessions in the future. So it would be great if you could answer those for us. Our next question is from Ludwig Landstedt. Going back to the gender lens or gender differences. His question is 2-part. One, in what are the differences, particularly in the global south, where there's relatively fewer women taking public transport, which you've touched on a bit earlier, but maybe more specifically, do measures such as women-only carriages help address some of these differences in women accessing public transport?
Yeah. So interesting question. Thank you for that. I would say there are certain initiatives being taken up. I mean, I recently saw a publication from World Resources Institute in India, the WRI in India, which is promoting women-only carriages in suburban metros in Mumbai in India. And there are also the pink auto rickshaws or tuk-tuks for women only. I mean, certainly, yes, that does encourage, I would say, women's participation. I cannot say, I don't have the data right now, and I'm not sure if the data is actually even there to say how many women take public transportation versus men. So there is not that specific number. So I think that's where having the data is very important rather than going off on perceptions. But yes, so first we need to measure how many women are actually walking, cycling, using public transport versus private. We do know what is women's participation in the labor force, for example. So we can make some assumptions based on that about their travel to work, but travel for all other reasons has to be accounted for. Now, after that, I would say, yes, gender, I would say segregated coaches, buses, all of that helps. But my view is that that's a short-term solution or short to medium-term solution. I think in the long-term solution, we really need to address systemic issues in the global context of which relates to gender-based violence or harassment. I think that needs to be addressed, and segregating, transport is a solution, but I don't think that's a long-term solution. I think we also need to address more systemic issues here.
Thanks, Parnika. I agree. It sort of feels like a bit of a band-aid because you're not really addressing the reason why women need to be segregated. So yeah, I agree with you. So we're coming to the end of the session. I'll leave it at that for the questions. Thank you for sending in so many great ones. We're going to send a follow-up email to all of our participants. So if you have any other queries about any of the research, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We'd be happy to provide further information. Thank you very much, Parnika, for your great presentation. And thank you to all of the other people who have been involved in this report. And thank you again for joining us today. And if you would like to attend our next Ask the author session, there will be one next Tuesday on improving the quality of walking and cycling in cities. So I'm going to pop the details for that in the chat. And thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. Thank you, everyone.